What's up, gamers? Welcome to episode 54 of the Business Casual Gamers podcast. This is the show focused on gamers with jobs, families who have things to do in real life. My name is Chris Smoke, and as always, I am joined by the illustrious Mr. Aaron Connick. Sir, how are you today?
I'm awesome, Chris. How are we doing?
I am excellent. You know, this is a really interesting show I think we have here. In today's episode, some of you might have heard last year we were talking a little bit about this little thing called the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. We're going to ask that question. Is this the perfect 20 plus 1? We say 20 plus 1 for a special reason we're going to talk about in a little bit, but that's what's coming in this episode. Before we get started, though, I want to remind you, please check us out on our website, businesscasualgamers.com. There you can find links to absolutely everything for us. Twitter, social media, YouTube kinds of things. Please take the opportunity to go there and take a look at those things. If you want to go to us on Twitter directly, you can find us at BIS Casual Gamers. That's at BIS Casual Gamers. YouTube, put in the term Business Casual Gamers, and you're going to find us there as well. All of these podcast episodes are going to be on YouTube as well, along with some other content that's going to come along a little bit later. We're still in the process of kind of working through what the new formats are going to look like, so please bear with us there. And finally, I'll ask you to please take the time to rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcast. Please go through take the opportunity to rate us, give us constructive feedback. We really, really appreciate that. It's how we connect with our audience. It's also how we gain popularity and hopefully find tap into some new areas of our audience. So we do appreciate that. As you're talking to friends, mention us. It's surprising, Aaron, how many people actually are business casual gamers when they start kind of understanding and kind of catching in on what it is that we're doing here. So with that, Aaron, we're going to go into our topic here. Now, we talked about the perfect 21, right?
Yeah.
And so this is interesting. So back in September of 2017, we talked about how the Super Nintendo was the greatest console of all time. And that is not subjective. That's objective fact.
No, I think pretty much anybody who disagrees is just wrong, right?
More or less.
Or
yes.
they just weren't alive to play it. That's fine. Understandable.
That's kind of an excuse.
Yeah,
not really.
Not
really, but that's right. And we brought that up back in September because we talked about the SNES Classic Edition was coming out. And for those of you who don't know, what basically happened was back in I think it was 2016, Nintendo brought out the NES Classic Edition,
right,
which is effectively a little small version of the NES with an emulator on it that has a set of games. And of course, it flew off shelves. It's absolutely impossible to find one of those for a reasonable price right now. According to Nintendo, they're going to resell it, but we'll see if that actually happens.
Yeah.
So fast forward to 2017, September, Nintendo released the SNES version of this. And again, it's very similar in size to the NES Classic. It has 20 plus 1 games. It is a small form factor. And one of the more interesting pieces about this, Aaron, was that it actually had an HDMI output. And that's what also made the NES Classic good as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about the nuances and why that's interesting. But here, in this episode, we're going to talk about what about this entire SNES Classic Edition works, what really doesn't work, and then we're going to give you some options for what should have made the cut.
Yeah.
Of those 20 plus 1, what should we have cut? What should have laid on the cutting room floor, and what should have been put in there instead?
Because that's big for us, right? I mean, let's be honest. If this is our favorite console, you can, even though in theory you don't have constraints, right? You could buy. We've got. For people watching on YouTube, right? If you have a Super Nintendo, if you have an actual original SNES, you can go buy all the games you want. You don't need to be constrained to 20 plus 1. But if this is the model where Nintendo is going to create scarcity, you do have to ask yourself what do I want on the list, right? And that becomes a very important question. That seems, now seeing the second iteration, that seems like a model that Nintendo is very comfortable with, to say we're not gonna give you everything. We're gonna we'll talk about whether they gave you the good stuff or not. But we are going to pick a selection of games. We're not just going to say we're going to give you this many to start and then there's DLC or whatnot. There's many ways you could do it, but they've clearly chosen this model and they seem to be running with it.
Well, and that will also, we should give a little bit of a caveat. Now, we understand that in many cases there was a part to be played from licensing costs, for example, right? You can't necessarily put every big game in the world there because Nintendo ultimately had a licensing budget They certainly spent it on some very good games. So we're kind of throw that off a little bit. We're just going to say, okay, maybe we can do a 20+ one that's a little bit better than the 20+ one that's there right now. But before we do that, let's talk a little about the console and the hardware. You, Aaron, you brought up the fact that yes, the original system did have those cartridges that you can plug in. You have a lot of leeway there. But here's the interesting part, right? So think about, for those of you that listen to the podcast, think about how big and heavy that SNES really was. And so, here on the for the YouTube channel, we're actually showing my SNES. And what is interesting about this is, I'm actually kind of struggling to hold this, Aaron. It's a little bit heavier than I thought.
Yeah.
It's big and it's bulky. It's got all those connections. And one of the things that's funny about that people don't realize when you think about these old kinds of consoles is it's not as simple as taking an old SNES or an old NES and plugging it into our modern day LCD plasma type TVs. Right? There are issues with that. Resolution among one of them. But a lot of us, like people like me who have had, been in the speedrunning scene, who wanted to be able to play on higher definition or things of that nature, have gone through the process of, painful process in some cases of modding their systems, going out and spending $100 on a chip and modding them to make sure that they can get HDMI out through some weird esoteric other like European connection standards like SCART.
Yeah, because that's something where I think for many people who are retro gamers, right, who are playing the older consoles, you've really got to go one of two routes unless you just want the gaming experience to look like absolute garbage. And and some people are willing to tolerate it, and these are constraints you've got to deal with. But people typically go one of two routes. Either one, they go with the old CRT television that you hope you can pick up for a decent price.
At a Goodwill,
you break your back bringing it into your house. Maybe you've got room for it. Maybe you don't. And so that's always one setup, is that you basically get the TV that you would need back in the day to make it not look like garbage. Or two, try to get the technology to upscale or make the Super Nintendo scale to something that is at least passable by modern standards on modern TVs. And none of those have been, to your point, inexpensive. I mean, it's not the most expensive thing in the world, but it's certainly something when you look at it and you say, like, I already own the game, I already own the console, I just want to play it and not have it look like garbage. You don't want to incur that extra expense.
Well, you think about what, I'll tell you what I've spent on getting, because I wanted to be able to record high-quality video for the purposes of speed running and also for Twitch TV kinds of streaming applications. I've actually gone through and probably spent maybe $100 here or there on just connectivity hardware, upscalers, HDMI switches, all sorts of things like that. I've also spent $100 on, say, like the NES, my Famicom. I updated that to have HDMI out. I've done some similar things through various upscalers as well for the Super Nintendo. Luckily, Super Nintendo is a little bit easier. But you know what? It's a non-trivial amount of money. You're going to spend like anywhere from $50 to $150 if you want to do it right. Now, what's interesting about this to me is most people aren't that crazy. Most people don't have that need. Most people, like you said, Aaron, they're going to go spend $10 or $5 at a Goodwill to get a TV, and they're going to go break their backs to get the things back, and then they're going to go out and have to find the games, and they're going to unfortunately find out what I found out is that a lot of these really good games are not super cheap. Right? And so like Earthbound is a perfect example. Earthbound is a game that I absolutely love. I was dying to play this game, but it's still like $200 for a loose cart. And, I get it. Some people will say, okay, go the emulation route. I'm not really wanting to do that. I really prefer to pay somebody for something.
Sure.
Especially, we talked about kind of helps the indie dev scene or whatever. But by Nintendo releasing this thing, and, I'm just for context, I'm holding it up here on the screen for those of you on the YouTube channel. But imagine this. This thing fits literally in the palm of my hand. It weighs absolutely nothing. It looks exactly like my Super Nintendo, the bigger one that I just showed, and it has HDMI out. It has a nice little USB DCN, and it also has the ability to connect other kind of Wii-style connector controllers. And I think that this is such a cool idea because not only is this nostalgic, you have this little baby thing, but what this means is I can take those 20 games. I can get them in high quality HDMI out, 1080p. Granted, the actual screen size is smaller when you think about 4x3 or pixel perfect images. But that said, it is still really, really convenient. I can put this in my existing setup. I can play it just like my PS4, just like my Switch or anything else. And, most of the games that I would want to play are on that list, but not all.
Yeah, now I think the HDMI, to start with just kind of the feature set, the HDMI is really big for me, right? I've got where I set up my games, I've got a nice receiver, I've got plenty of HDMI inputs. And so to me, having something that all I need is the power line, essentially. It doesn't have a massive brick like the old school NES brick. And then you've got an you just need an open HDMI port.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fantastic. And I've always said, look, all of these games are SNES era graphics. And so you've got to, even though
by that you talk about awesome graphics?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. Many of them awesome. So. But I do think that certainly once you set the resolution aside and say, okay, I want it to properly scale on the TV, I want it to not be awful on widescreen, like all of these little things where you're saying, I just want it doesn't have to be better because of this. I want that classic experience, but I just want it to work with the gear that I currently have. And I think that's the one critical decision that they made that I really applaud them for, that they have looked at it and said, we understand that people are going to be putting this into an existing setup, and we just want to make this as easy as possible. Plug it in, find an open outlet, and you're pretty much good to go. And I think that is, I appreciate the simplicity of the design behind this.
Yeah, I can agree. And for someone, like I said, for someone like me who is more prone to go jump through ridiculous hoops to make sure you have clean, high quality audio and video out of these retro consoles, it says something, I think, that I have, even me has kind of gravitated towards this as an overall option. Now, we'll talk a little bit in a moment about the packed-in games and some of the limitations there. But, as a package from a hardware perspective, there's really, unless I'm trying to play a game that's not on that list of 20+1 games, of course I will play it on the emulated version.
Right.
Unless, the only nuance there, and this is for speedrunners, I haven't looked, to be honest, as whether the emulation is faithful or not to the hardware. I don't know that it is. But if that were an issue with timing, you can do that. But that's a small subset. It is so accessible to everybody, whether it's like super technical, super nerds like me, or people who, like you said, Aaron, the people who grew up in the 80s and the 90s, or people who were born after that, who really just want the opportunity to be able to really experience the kinds of games that we did back in the early 90s without having to fight through, going through buying these CRT monitors, CRT TVs, fighting to get all the connections right, and still having overall lackluster response.
Yeah, and one of the other things, and Chris, I know you and I are very particular collectors about this. You held up, and you can hold it up again, the original SNES. One of the things that you notice, and Chris is somebody who takes very good care of his stuff, but I've noticed this with my SNES and my NES, the coloring on the machine, because Sony and others have gone to black consoles, which makes it way easier to hide the aging process, if you will. But you look back in the day with the light gray, the reality is over time they start to yellow and they start to show dirt. I mean, even if you've taken very good care, just over time there's wear and tear on the consoles that will start to show. And I certainly, as somebody who likes to keep stuff in my collection that looks fairly close to new, you look at the coloration difference between a new out-of-the-box SNES Classic. I really appreciate that for the collector, that they've allowed you to have that nice, pristine console, nice controllers that aren't rattling. If you just acquiring some of that stuff nowadays without paying an arm and a leg, right? I can get a functioning SNES controller, an original one, but to get a really good one that I'm not going to feel like is going to break on me, you've got to pay up for that nowadays, because so many of what's out, so much of what is out there is used. It's the stuff that somebody like us would be selling, who grew up playing their SNES, right?
I get I don't appreciate that you're calling my stuff ugly and garbage.
It kind of, I mean, yeah,
it's true. I mean, we're talking realistically, we're talking 30-plus-year-old hardware here.
Absolutely.
So I mean, it is, everyone struggles to really and this is hardware that for me, this is hardware that I had when I was a kid. Yeah. So, I mean, all the broken controllers, all of the anger and the rage that we got right of some of the games that are on this list, it's funny. We try to take care of those kinds of things, but you're right. After 30-plus years, that's definitely an interesting thing.
I tried to do the spinning pile driver enough times. I couldn't get it to work, and so I'm taking this controller down with me.
Yeah, and so one of the things I want to mention, speaking of controllers, very good segue here. I have one of the controllers here for the SNES Classic, and those of you who are looking on the YouTube channel can see, and I'll certainly describe it, it is the exact same controller, albeit a different connector, but the exact same controller that we had on the original Super Nintendo, and that is absolutely critical to making this thing work, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah. I think that anybody, and I when they did the NES Classic, I was really happy that they both, to your point, kept the form factor of the actual console the same. But I think anybody who is buying this, they want to hold the exact same controller.
You have to.
That's
you get
big.
The feel.
And I really appreciate the fact that you don't think about it as much, right? If you were to play any of the games that we're going to talk about in a little bit, you could certainly play them on a PlayStation-like controller or an Xbox, whatever the form factor was. And even when the Wii Store came out, where you had all of the games that you could download and play by holding the Wiimote sideways and using it. Right, it had all the buttons that you needed, but you have that muscle memory of playing some of these games over time. And so if you don't have that original controller experience, we did it when we talked about our controller episode, right? There is a certain nostalgia there to say, playing this game feels like this, right? And you just have that mental association, even if you weren't thinking about it at the time. And I really appreciate the length that they went to make sure they gave you the same. Now, I don't know. I haven't done enough to look at all the internals of the parts and all that to see if there are any really noteworthy differences that maybe aren't obvious to somebody who's not breaking apart a controller and looking at the components. But it definitely feels the same in the hand, and there was nothing that, as I played it, that really jumped out to me as a difference.
I think it's, as someone who has created many Franken controllers to switch like Super Famicom parts and buttons and all that stuff to get the perfect controller that works for speedrunning, like Super Metroid, for example. I broke these open, and they really do look very similar. I mean, there might be a slight difference in weight. I haven't weighed them, but in the end, it's almost all. They're very simple controllers, number one, but it's very, very similar to what you might have. The other thing that's interesting is, while I agree with you 100%, Aaron, it is very important to make sure that you have the original controller to get the full experience. They do allow you to connect things like the Wii Pro controllers and other things to the system that tend to work really well, if that's your prerogative. Now, right. I would, again, recommend against it because it's really important in my mind to get the full experience, but they do give you that option there.
Now let me ask you one question, Chris, because if there's one thing that when I saw, and this was also true for the NES Classic Edition, that I kind of had to take a moment to think about. I have been so many generations removed at this point from using a wired controller that when I saw the wires, I kind of thought, and I said, I appreciate the faithfulness because I do think that there is a nostalgia factor there, right? There is, and there's clearly a cost factor, right? They're trying to keep the cost of this reasonable, which I think they've done, and it's more expensive to introduce wireless technology and to put that as kind of the base offering. But I will tell you, Chris, every time I haul out the Dreamcast, every time I haul out the SNES, my setup has as large as I could pack it to be reasonable for the room TV. If I have to sit 2 feet closer for everything to reach and my kids not to trip over the controllers, that's something I have to think about. And that's something that when it came out, I said, I would honestly be willing to pay a little bit extra to cut the wires and just be able to sit on my couch and not have to worry about wires coming unplugged during gameplay. So what are your thoughts about the decision to go wired?
It's interesting. I agree. It's probably more out of cost savings than anything else. But think about the NES Classic was a little bit different in that I think the controllers were actually small. which is terrible. And certainly the controller, like the cord length, was I think it's 2 or 3 feet. I mean, you think about 2 or 3 feet is absolutely going to be right on top. Like I could do it in my gaming setup, but most setups where you're in a living room in a normal like US style home, you really don't have a lot of room to move there. Couple of things. Yeah, I think there is an option, I know, to get a longer cable if you want it. I think there's probably a way for us to kind of finagle, if someone hasn't already done it, a wireless connection to it. But there's still something, if we're going to go for nostalgia factor, right, and I'm going to be hardcore about this, there's something about, back when I was a kid, my parents had, it was big at the time, right? It was nothing by today's standards, but a big TV. And I used to sit in front of it, like way too close to it, and kind of just look up at it as I played. And I actually think that recreating that is probably a good thing too.
That's fair.
It's like, okay, it's not so close that it really is it's not 3 feet. You can be a good 6 or 7, 8 feet away from it, but there is something about when I first got mine. I plugged it in the family room, and me and my daughter, sat down, and we, just like I did, sit down, look up at the TV and start playing some games. And I think that's part of the overall nostalgia piece. That's just my perspective. I'm sure a lot of people don't agree with that.
I don't think you can go wrong. I do think that having an offering would be nice if this is going to be, and let's talk.
This is Nintendo that we're talking about.
This is Nintendo. They still can't figure out that people actually go online and download games.
They don't
Chris.
care.
But I do think that is something that, as they think about this, because I do feel like this is not the last we've seen of the consoles, right? Mm-hmm. We haven't gone through all the generations. I could certainly see them re-upping with an N64 generation, something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
And so I think that's something for them to reflect on. Do we want, if this is going to be a mass market way that we offer games, what does the mass market want? Do they want the nostalgia, or do they want what is the easiest thing to fit into my modern day home and setup? And that's a question. And will people pay for it, right? Well, that's another thing, is what does that do to your sales if you say, okay, I'll give you the wireless controllers, Chris, but it's going to cost you another $20 in the package. How many people say, I was in at like 80, I was in at 100, but if you're going to put it at 20, maybe I just leave that outside of the Amazon cart.
I'll tell you what, Aaron. If we're talking like N64 Classic Edition, I'd pay you to be able to use a DualShock 4, because there's no way in hell I'm going to be using that
you god awful. The C button.
For those of you who have not, please go back and listen to our episode or watch our episode on controllers.
That controller,
because that I don't want that controller wireless, wired, or anything. I would rather use like a hammer and some nails to try to play a game than do that. So, I mean, I don't know. I think you're right. I think that in the end, I think the option really is to have some level of nostalgia potential, and then also have another offering that makes it, you've already gone to the point where you've paid someone to build these emulators, put these games in, make them run perfectly, get the really great HDMI output. You should probably also go a little bit further to allow them to have a little bit more of an enjoyable experience, at the expense of an additional cost, I'd think. And I think that's probably going to be something they're going to do. I don't know. Nintendo is acting very surprised by the response they've gotten from NES Classics and SNES Classics, like the sales numbers. I don't know if that's reality, or if they're just kind of playing coy.
Sure.
But I'd say after what this has certainly showed them is that there is a market for this, and it's not just, hey, I'm John Smith or Jane Smith that played games when I was, 10 in the 90s, and now I want to spend $50 to $100 on something that helps me relive this. There are people coming out of the woodwork, both gamers and non-gamers, former gamers, all those kinds of people are coming out of the woodwork to buy and play these things. And this is going to be a long-term market for them. And, now that then gives us a really good segue into the next point of the discussion, which is the games that are packed in. And also, Aaron, I want to talk a little bit about the obvious place here, the obvious point here, which is the limitations. There are 20+1 games on the system, period. There is no other, at this point, no legal way or opportunity to put new games on this system. Is that a deal killer, or is that something that we can work around?
Yeah, I think for me, when I first saw it, as somebody who, when the eShop or whatever iteration Nintendo was calling it, when the Wii came out or when the DS came out, I think that I was somebody who jumped on that, and I didn't buy everything, right? Because I still, at that time, I owned all of my SNES collection. But I did, for some of the games where I said, hey, I want access to this, I did rebuy some of those, and the pricing was fine. But when I saw this, I said, okay, the reality of it is there's only so many games on any console generation that I want to go back and play. Right? I don't need access to it all. And so there was a certain element of, okay, doesn't need to be 100 games, but there could certainly be some additional ones that I would like. And I can appreciate the fact that they chose to go the route to say, if we're going to have this be a consumer product that we're just going to sell at a bargain price, if you will, the best way to do that is to just put everything that's ever going to be on the system on the console, and just send it and say, this is what you're buying. Here's what's on offer.
Right.
If you want something else, we're still going to make that available. You can still go to the eShop. And I think I didn't go through this in preparation for the episode, but I do think all of these games are separately downloadable at this point on some iteration, whether you're going from the Switch, whether you're
minus
going from
the
Wii
plus
U,
one, which we'll get to in a second.
Well, yeah, okay. Big loss. Yeah, but I think that the fact that they have, over time, it took time for some of these games to become available. But if you're making the decision as a consumer today, do I want this? Or if I have a Switch or a Wii U, which only you have, waiting for it.
Only I am the only one.
I actually read an article. Not to digress too much, but I actually read that Wii U's are actually in sharp demand because people are trying to collect them all, and people are finding very few used Wii U's out there. So, Chris, there is a market for you to offload if you so choose.
Ironically, I just disconnected my Wii U this morning. Yeah.
Well, so you at least have avenues to get these games if you want to play with a wireless controller. If you want them, if you don't want to put an additional system in your setup, if you've got limited HDMI plugins, whatever the case may be. But I do think that if you are the limitations, to answer your original question, not a deal breaker to me. When this came out, I kind of thought about it and said, okay, what games on the list do I not currently own that I could just go play off of my Wii or whatever it may be? And I already had most of them, but I still, just based on the nostalgia alone and the fact that I think the hardware itself was a home run for them, I would be willing. I do not currently own this, but I am definitely looking at it and am interested in potentially buying.
So Aaron, on that note, let's go through these 20+1 games.
Yes.
And Aaron, I'm going to go down the list, okay? And what I want is a hot take, okay? First thing that comes to mind, couple phrases, things that help you, and we'll move along to get through these 20+1 relatively quickly here. Okay, number 1, Contra 3.
This was unappreciated gem.
Absolutely.
This is one of my, not to go too far in the deep end, but every off the wall Contra game, I am a buyer of that game.
It's one of the best multiplayer games of the era.
Absolutely.
I think, bar none. All right, next, Donkey Kong Country.
One of the best first-person offerings. I would have been shocked if this wasn't on the list, because to your point on licensing budgets, it's first party. It's free, and it's great.
It really is. And people, what's so funny about this is people tend to look at this game and kind of think that it's, like, for some reason they didn't enjoy it, because it is the first foray into quote-unquote CG as they model the characters and put those animations into a 16-bit game. I think it looks really good, unlike some other games that we'll talk about here in a moment. Number 3, Aaron, Earthbound.
This was one, maybe I was least surprised because it's a first-party game, but this is one where I'm like, I'm so happy Nintendo made this so that this could make the list.
Oh, best game in the world, and I every day, Aaron, not a day goes by that I'm not angry that I cannot buy this game for my real Super Nintendo. I'm happy, don't get me wrong, happy to have it in the SNES Classic Edition, but I really wanted to have the big box.
I was about to say, all I think of with this game is the big box,
I'm not
which means
spend
it was
$1 million
effective.
on it. It's frustrating.
It is $1 million.
Number 4, I don't know, Aaron, have you heard of this game? It's Final Fantasy 3. I don't. Did we talk about that before?
Did we do a Hall of Fame entrant on this one?
Oh, that was that one.
That game.
Oh, that was that game. Okay.
I was actually funny because I was like, I wonder, I was actually curious that they called it Final Fantasy 3, which is, again, what it was released on in the States, so I agree. This was the one that when I read the initial list, I went, whoa, they went deep on this list, because this one, I will guarantee you, cost them some money to get this in the box.
So good. I know, and it's so good.
Yeah, but I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, we can talk about another game that I would put slightly higher on my own personal list, but to me, to talk about this console generation, the Square RPGs have to be represented. Like, you would literally be ignoring the most important part of the console if you didn't get some representation.
Nintendo should have, whatever they paid, they could have paid like $20 billion for that to get that license. I agree. Next up is F-Zero.
This is my personal favorite racing game on the console. We'll get to the other one that I think would be on most people's list. I was really happy to see this. I think this was the best F-Zero ever made, personally. And this is one of those games where, even though I think there are plenty of fans that like this game, this is one that I think really belongs in that top 20 games. And I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that when I was making, if I would have made my own list. But I looked at it, I said, this belongs.
It would have made my list. I mean, F-Zero is, I've played almost more of F-Zero than almost any non-RPG game for SNES. And I don't know why. It just happened that way. I mean, I love the music. I love the controls. I love how every car feels different. It's really, really cool. Next up, I've not played this game, but Kirby's Dream Course.
Yeah, so I will tell you, when I played the NES Classic, I was not a huge Kirby fan growing up, but I actually those were some of my favorite games on the NES Classic that I actually kept playing. I like the Kirby games, and I think we'll get to this with the next entrant as well. I don't know that I could say with certainty, as a not a huge fan, what I think should have made the list. I don't know if I would have been clamoring for multiple Kirby entries.
Yeah, and
I don't think it had that. I would say Donkey Kong Country, in my mind, is more deserving. I would put 1 and 2 on the list before multiple Kirbys.
Yeah, personally. And so what Aaron's referring to is the next one is actually Kirby Superstar. And that is very strange to have 2 Kirbys among the 20+1 games that are here. Yeah. 2 of those are Kirbys. Now, I don't know why, to your point, Aaron, why you wouldn't pick some other sequels that are a little bit more different games, which we'll get to, in place of at least one of those. The next one, absolute classic, Mega Man X.
This is honestly like Contra 3. I think people forget that this series debuted on SNES. Yeah. It's been remade, it's been repackaged in anthologies and things like that, but that is an absolute staple of the SNES, and I think anybody who loved Mega Man, we can debate all day long whether you like the X with the charge shots and all that, or what, but Mega Man is an all-time classic franchise, and this is the one that belongs on there. I was really happy to see this, and again, another one, Capcom developed game. This was not free to get on the system, so I was very happy that they committed the resources to get this included.
Great game to speedrun, as it were, as well. It's actually pretty easy to pick up if you're interested. The next game, now I know there's a little bit of religious war in how you pronounce this, but I'll say Secret of Mana.
Okay. This was the one that I was most surprised by, yet happiest to see on the list. I think that the fact that people will be able to experience this game, now I know they're remaking the game,
right?
But the original game, you can do multiplayer, couch co-op. My brother and I played this game to death, the two of us. And it is a game that I still think holds up to this day. If you want to play couch co-op with somebody, this is a phenomenal game. I will also tell you that I think this, I don't know how to rank order necessarily. This is one of the most underappreciated soundtracks in gaming history. One of the best. Some of the composer, you want to talk about somebody who cracked the code of SNES sound. Secret of Mana is the one to me that just consistently blows my mind of what they were able to get out of that system. And even if you just listen to it for the soundtrack or play through it for that, I think it's worth it.
No, I absolutely agree. And interestingly, on the Secret of Mana thing, I mean, one of the things that stands out to me, I don't know why, is the game does have some flaws, though, right? And one of the things that really frustrated me was the invincibility frames between hitting enemies between swipes is actually a little bit mistimed, and it always frustrated me. Even to this day, I get frustrated just thinking about that. Granted, it's going to be the same way in this version here, but hopefully in the remake, and I know some people don't like that remake, hopefully that remake will help kind of clean some of that stuff up. Now, Aaron, we're going to move on to the next one here. This is one of your favorite games, I know, Star Fox.
And now, the voiceovers are great, Chris. Let's be honest. I do enjoy a good Star Fox, original Star Fox. Yeah, it's the best. Slippy, peppy, those voices. But I will say, even I was not surprised to see this on the list. I mean, obviously the characters from Smash Brothers are popular. Like, people have an affinity towards this franchise.
Represented, right?
But this game is unplayable. I'm sorry. If you have tried to go back and play Star Fox, Chris, just turn around the back of the box real quick. Right? If you pick this up off the shelf and just look at the screenshots that are represented on the back of the box, you look at this and you'd say, wow, like these games, they look older, clearly, but these games still hold up.
Yeah, they do. They look great.
Ugly duckling on the back of the box, Chris, is those wireframe models for Star Fox. It looks not just old, but it looks old in all the worst ways, where it just looks old to the point where I'm saying, I don't want to look at this. And I don't want to look at it in pixelated, trying to upscale version. I don't want to look at it in 1080p. I just don't want to look at any of it. And I don't necessarily fault them because it's a first-party game and people like the characters. But this is one of those games you turn on for 5 minutes, you refresh your memory on, oh yeah, there's Star Fox. Yeah, I can say I played that, and then you never play it again.
Well, and this is the funny thing. It's almost as if they there's a little thing I'll talk about in a minute here. It's almost as if they knew. You're absolutely right. This is one of those games that Nintendo has tried so hard over the years to really continue to make relevant with some of these newer versions of Star Fox that continue to fail miserably. I think you can make really, really good like space fighter kind of games. For whatever reason, this is just not working.
Oh, yeah.
Star Fox, they were hyped it back in the day. I bought the game. It's just not very good. And to your point, when I picked it up and played it on this version, it is really hard to play. And I get it. We have been talking for 2+ years now on how graphics don't matter to the gameplay. Well, this is just so absolutely distracting that I can't even. I'm just going to end it there. So the next one, Aaron, and this is one that I personally really, really enjoy. This particular version is Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting.
Yeah, this one, another one that I think is a defining game and a defining franchise of the Super Nintendo. I will say that just on a personal level, when they re-released the HD remake of Street Fighter II, I certainly want to play this more on a later generation console because I have an arcade stick and I just enjoy that experience better. When you're a kid and you only have the Super NES controller, you'll play with what you have, right? I mean, that's what you dealt with and you made it work. But I will tell you the experience of, I made the joke earlier, but trying to do the Super Pile Driver and do a 360-degree spin on the D-pad, it's hard.
It's hard.
It's just really hard to do.
So awesome.
And if you've got an arcade stick, that is just so much easier to actually make sure you do the move that you intended to do. But I'm glad to see it on here because I feel like people, even if it's with a D-pad, that was such an iconic game for that console. For me personally, I know for you as well.
Yeah, and I have yet to. I need to do this. I remember there was a code that you could put in where you could get. I think you can only go like 4 stars or something as far as turbo speed. I think you can do it like 8 or 9 or 10 stars if you put in a code, and the game gets so ridiculously fast. I used to love playing it in that version at that speed, and so I'll have to go back and check it out. But I do think that is one of the best ones available. Now, the next game, Aaron, undoubtedly one of the best. This is back when saying Konami meant I want to buy that game, right? As opposed to now where I think that's garbage.
Oh, it's another bad Metal Gear game? Oh, really? You just gave Kojima a pile of money to... Yeah.
And you know how we feel about Kojima. Anyway, this game... So good, Aaron. Super Castlevania 4.
I was surprised to see this on there, and not because, again, I think it absolutely deserves to be in your top 20, But I was actually, this was one where I didn't know as many people who owned this growing up. So I was kind of, I didn't think there was as much nostalgia for this, compared to like a Donkey Kong Country or some of those where you'd say, okay, those are clearly going to make the list. This is one that, given the fact that it's not a first-party game, you've got to be intentional about putting up the money. And again, I think this is a completely worthy choice, and I was very impressed to see it on the list. But it's maybe one of the most surprising games.
Yeah, it's a really good talk about the Secret of Mana thing. I mean, honestly, I think this music rivals Secret of Mana as some of the best music on the Super Nintendo. It's great. The game, like the whip mechanics, are really good. The only some people would call it a positive, some people call it a negative, but the only thing that I would say about it is its difficulty is it's pretty challenging. You have to get really good to be able to reliably make it through the last quarter or third of the game. And that to some people could turn them off. Now, on the subject of difficulty, Aaron, this is notoriously probably certainly one of the most difficult games on the platform, Super Ghouls and Ghosts.
Yeah, this is the one where of all the games that were on here, especially because it's non-first party, I thought this one was maybe the poorest choice. I would not have spent my licensing budget on this game. Every time I go back, and I have played this, I own this on the Capcom collection. Yeah. I go back and play this periodically, but this is one of those games, much like Star Fox, where I play it for 5 to 10 minutes and say, now I remember why I didn't like this game. It's not even that the difficulty is bad. I mean, it is a very hard game. Any of the Ghosts and Goblins, Ghouls and Ghosts, wherever you want to go, are very challenging games. But I just don't think it's all that great. I mean, if you're talking about just breaking it down to the genre, where you're talking about a side-scrolling, part platformer, part action game, Super Castlevania 4 is just a better game. No, it's not even close. To me, it's not even a fair comparison. And to your point, Castlevania 4 is a challenging game, but it is just a superior. You feel much more in control of the character. The level design's better. The music's better. Just everything about it is the right kind of challenge. Not frustrating, not, this jumping mechanic is just god-awful. It's things like that where I do not like Super Ghouls and Ghosts. There is no way I would have included it on this collection, even though I know a lot of people who did play that, and that was one of the games they got for Christmas, and they played a lot of it. But I wouldn't have put it on.
I agree. I think it's a little bit of a throwaway slot. We'll talk about what we might put in place of it, but it's funny because everything in that game is designed to be very challenging, which is very frustrating for many players. I mean, I don't think it's a little bit of a spoiler. I don't think it's that big of a deal. But what is funny about this game is not only is it punishingly difficult, but you have to beat it twice to actually beat it. Like you go to the end and then you play again.
And you've got to get the bracelet. It's terrible.
It's crazy. It is a really big oversight in my mind that actually made it in the list. Next in the list is Super Mario Kart, Aaron. This is the racer you were referring to.
Yeah, now this is one where I think people forget at times, because this was not, I mean, this is a huge game. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to take away anything from the popularity of this game, but I think a lot of people forget about this on the Super NES, because this is a franchise that has spawned so many sequels, and every generation since then has had its Mario Kart that has been bigger selling than the last one. But to me, this was a great game. It was a great local multiplayer game. And this may be the most important game that was released just because of how many copies this franchise has sold. I mean, I think, and I mentioned it on a past episode, but if I were to pull the charts today, I think this is their top-selling franchise of all time. And this is, so even though the individual game itself, one of the biggest selling games on the system, but I think what it went on to become, to me, this is just a historic game. If you were going to release, like a top 5 list, this to me would have to be on the cut that made it onto the SNES Classic.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, I think that as far as a racing game, F-Zero is a better racing game, but F-Zero is single player. What is so compelling, at least from me, about Mario Kart. Now, this is coming admittedly from a person who's not a big Mario Kart fan. Most of my fun with Mario Kart has been multiplayer, has been knocking your friends out from in front of you, or playing some of those versus maps. a lot of that kind of thing, in a sense, like a Mario Party-ish experience. I think that's why, kind of like why Super Smash Brothers has been big as well. I think that's really what drives it, and the fact that you can play multiplayer here, I think, is a good thing too. So, take that what it is. The next game is actually a really interesting one. I'm surprised to see it here, but I think it certainly does deserve its space, and that's Super Mario RPG.
Now, this is one I know people who would say that this game is the best RPG on the system. I don't agree with that, obviously. I mean, even on this box, I think that it is maybe one of the most unique RPGs.
It is,
and at the time it came out, it's had plenty of sequels, but I think it really broke the mold in a very interesting way, and I give it a lot of credit for that. I think it's an awesome game. I've played through it before. I own some of the later ones, but this was one where this was an unexpected one because, as I recall, I can't remember the exact development arrangement, but I believe this was co-developed and co-published with Square. Obviously, they used some characters, and I think that Nintendo put its own unique spin on the genre, and the game sold well. I think it has a huge fan following. I think it is one of those. I don't want to call it a cult classic because anything that Nintendo releases, especially a Mario game, it's going to sell well, let's be honest. But I think this was one where, unlike Mario Kart, unlike Donkey Kong Country, this is kind of one of the hidden Nintendo first-party gems, if you will. But I was very happy to see this on the list. I think it is absolutely deserving of a spot.
Yeah, I agree. And so, as a side note, if you're interested in the history of this particular game, I'll plug the Gaming Historian on YouTube. You can go look up Gaming Historian Super Mario RPG. Not only does he have a lot of other things, but the Super Mario RPG origin story was actually a really good video to watch. So I encourage you to go check that one out. Next, Aaron, we have a game that none of us have ever heard before, Super Mario World.
This would have to be, right? If you own a Super Nintendo, you own this game.
Yes.
Right? This is like, this has to be the greatest pack-in game of all time.
Right.
I mean, this was the Super Nintendo for many people because it was the game you got with your Super Nintendo. Mm-hmm. And this obviously would make the list for that reason, but it also happens to be, this would have been,
good game.
I mentioned it, while it didn't quite make my top 20 list, it's not far on the outside looking in. This is just one of the best games out there. And of all the first-party Nintendo, I always go back to this and say, this is why Nintendo is where it is today, is because it can say, I made Super Mario World. What have you done? Right?
Yeah, really.
This is one of those games.
Yeah, okay. I agree. It's funny to hear a packing game that is so well regarded and stands the test of time so long. While we say Super Mario Brothers or whatever for the NES was a really good packing game, really fun game, I still think this game outshines it in many ways. And that's just really special to have that. Obviously, they had to put it in there. It's first party. It's the best game, for a long time on the SNES. They had to do that. Next game. I'd say objectively best game in the entire 20+1 games, Super Metroid, Aaron?
This is where, Chris, when you think of, not to backtrack, but you think of the list we've just gone through, and then you're putting on heavyweights like, we also put Super Metroid on there.
Yeah.
These are the greatest games of all time. I think if you've been listening to this episode up to this point and you're not convinced that the Super Nintendo, we haven't even gotten to another one of the game, like a game that I think is even better than this, as good as Super Metroid is. And you're saying, we're still throwing out games that are, that's just like the greatest game ever.
Right.
And, this one's maybe slightly better or slightly worse. But, this, I think, shows you how impactful this console generation was. Super Metroid is a masterpiece, and it is we'll talk about it in a couple more slots of, this is the standard to which all other Metroids are measured, will be measured, probably in my mind will never measure up, just because how do you beat this game? It's so good. It's I don't even know, other than the fact that you have the fan versions that that are made for speedrunners out. It's just, how do you improve on this game? I don't know.
You can't. You're going to have an annual pilgrimage to Japan to Gunpei Yokoi's grave so that you can kneel down and thank him continuously for making him and the Deer Tier team for making one of the best games of all time, period.
Yeah.
End of story. Next, please. Aaron, the next game is Super Punch-Out.
Yeah, so this is another one where I had to think about for a little bit, because I think if you were to just say Nintendo and Punch-Out in the same sentence, I think you would have a lot of people say, oh, it's got to make the list. Now, for the NES Classic, I would say, okay, like original Mike Tyson's Punch-Out or Punch-Out, that's got to be on that console. But I don't know about Super Punch-Out. I thought Super Punch-Out was kind of... I mean, it's definitely not as good as the original Punch-Out, in my mind. I thought that especially some of the later enemies, some of the bosses like the Bruiser Brothers, they're not as iconic. And there's just... Part of it's just the nostalgia factor with actually fighting a real fighter in Mike Tyson. I mean, there's elements and there's reasons why. But I thought it kind of felt like a little bit of a lazy sequel. It was kind of the sequel that people were asking for, but that to me was not when you made the leap from NES to SNES, I wasn't really wowed by that game. I kind of longed for the original.
Yeah, it's one of those cases where I agree. There are some times in the Super Nintendo era where the crispness of controls and some other kind of difficult to describe and put into words nuances of gameplay between NES and SNES kind of sequel kinds of games occurred. I think this is one of those. It is a good game. It is probably not one of the top 20 games. It's not one of the best games in the system, and I agree. When you think about an NES Classic, I also agree that a Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would probably be the best, and I would say Mike Tyson's and not the, we've wiped Mike Tyson out of the game version. Obviously, they can't do that anymore. They could not put that game on NES in the Mike Tyson form. And I think that anything less than that is probably not doing... It's not the real version of the game, honestly. And so I agree. When you think about NES, you can't really put it in there for obvious reasons. SNES, version, yeah, I think there's a better play, and we'll hopefully give you a better play here in a minute for that one as a stand-in. Now, one of the next ones we'll talk about here, clearly nothing could take its place. That's Link to the Past.
Yes, so this is the one I was setting up, right? We're saying like when you're doing the back-to-back punch of Super Metroid and Link to the Past, you can almost just have the drop the mic and be like, okay, yes, I'm paying for this. This is the best console. But this game to me this was one I rented a bunch, and I had a close friend who owned this game, so I'd play his copy a lot. But I played this game so much, and this is one that I think that actually having an upscaled version of the game and being able to play this on a bigger screen, this is a game that I think takes advantage of it, and I think having that extra screen real estate and making it's such a colorful game. It's something that I think when you get the ability to dash, I think it's really fun. It looks lively. So this is one that I think holds even more so than many of the other games on this list. It holds up today in terms of visual style, and I'm really glad that this thing has been ported all the way into modern times. But I think, I know I've caveat this a little bit by saying the Fire Emblem games are still my favorite Nintendo games, but because they can't be either, the SNES ones never came out in America, but this is Nintendo's finest work, in my personal opinion, knowing that a lot of other games on this list are not too far behind.
No, I absolutely agree. There's nothing much else to say. I mean, it's just an excellent, amazing action-adventure game. It is just amazing. The next game, Aaron, this is one that, for me, is funny in that, and I want to get your take on it, and it is technically a sequel.
Yeah.
People dispute that, but I believe, it's in the title. And it also is unique in the fact that it used the Super FX chip for only the title screen, and that game is Yoshi's Island.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I will be honest, I'd played this on the Super Nintendo, but I didn't really play through most of this game until later in life, after later console generations came out. I still, to this day, don't like the crying baby Mario. That's really the worst part of the... This is a good game.
That's true.
This is a really good game. I don't like it as much as Super Mario World. But I think this is a really good game and a high-quality sequel that I was not surprised to see on this list. I think there's a lot of Mario fans who love this game, even though I agree there's a lot of debate about whether it's a sequel or not. But I do. I think it's a standout game for the console. But the fact that it's first party and the fact that it's Mario, I was not surprised to see this get a 2-game set rather than, Donkey Kong. I think clearly Super Mario World was the bigger game than Donkey Kong Country. So if I were to pick 2 franchises where I would have gone kind of maybe looking at a 1-2 punch of 2 games in the franchise, I would have personally gone Super Mario World and Donkey Kong Country, but was not surprised to see this one make the list.
Yeah, and we should clarify, obviously the subtitle for Yoshi's Island is Super Mario World 2.
Right.
So that's why many people say it's a sequel to Super Mario World, but other people say it's not really, and I can see arguments on both sides. So, yeah, I agree. It's really a fun game. You're right, the baby crying does kind of bother me too, but it is a fun game. Again, it's one of those ones where it's kind of like, I could go either way on it.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have some better options here that we could probably replace it with. But before we go, that's your 20. That's your core 20, right?
But Chris,
there's more.
If
you look at the bottom of the box, there is the list of 20 games we just went through, and then there's a plus. If you are brave enough, and this is no simple feat, to play and sit through the entire first level of Star Fox 1, you then unlock, Aaron, Star Fox 2. Which is an unreleased game. It was a game, in fact, that was so terrible and so bad, Nintendo decided not to release it, and now they are teasing it as the reason you buy one of these things, and it's garbage.
I'm not sure that they should have just put a minus symbol next to it. It's like, okay, we had a really great system that we put out, and I guess we can pack in Star Fox 2, and we wasted memory to put this on there. Nobody wants to play this game. This is something that you'd say, if you were going to build a collection and you wanted to own it all, or you wanted to put downloadable games out there, much like when they came out with the Wii Shop and you had the lost levels that were put out. Okay, if you're going to release them all and you have this available, sure, make it available. There's completionists that are out there that would say, I want to say that I owned everything that was developed. So I don't have a problem with that, but if you're literally talking about taking up valuable real estate, I mean, I gave a game earlier, right? Donkey Kong Country 2 could have made the list in this place. Yeah. Donkey Kong Country 2 is a great video game. This is not a great video game. Star Fox 2 is a bad video game. And in fact, it is a terrible video game that nobody was asking for. And so this is one where I think you get a combination of the masses aren't going to want it because, A, the masses don't even know it existed, and Star Fox is definitely not the most popular game by a long shot on this console. And 2, I think even the completionists or the Nintendo enthusiasts, it's not good enough to make them want to play it. Even if they appreciate the fact that they know it's unreleased and all of those things.
Once you play it, you'll know you don't want to play it.
Nobody wants to play it. And so I thought this was the most... I feel like this is one of those kind of back-of-the-box quotes where Nintendo thinks they're doing themselves a favor by giving you this unreleased content. But the reality is, it's just a bad game, and it should have been left to die as they originally decided to do.
Well, it's almost as if they thought that they needed to have a reason for people to buy this. Right. So they're like, hey, guys, we never released this game, Star Fox 2, because it was so bad. The only way you're ever going to get it is with this. So go buy it. And that is, by the way, Nintendo, not the reason people are buying this.
It's like, did you read the games that you put on this console?
Right, exactly.
Did you just read the title list?
Well, if you're interested, go to Awesome Games Done Quick's like either YouTube or Twitch page, 2018. Watch the speed run of it. That's the quickest way to experience that piece of garbage. You don't have to play it, number one, and it's pretty darn quick as well. So that's a fun thing to watch. So we talked about those 20 plus 1 games. We talked about which ones of those probably could be swapped out for things. And Aaron, I want to take the last couple minutes here and go through some games that we think should be subbed in. I will start by picking up one of the ones, we talked about a little while back. We had an episode on couch co-op. And I think this, as we described, is really a perfect example of trying to get people back into couch co-op because of the wired, because of the fact that it's not networked. It's just old school 16-bit awesomeness in the same room. And in my mind, when you're thinking about games that exemplify that, we'll go through a couple here, but in my mind, nothing does as good of a job as, ironically, a Konami game. And this is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time. This game is absolutely one of the most fun games to play co-op. We should know, Aaron, because we played the devil out of this game when we were kids. It is such a good experience for the era, and for the life of me, I don't know why they didn't include this game.
Yeah, it was a bit. I mean, aside from we've mentioned that they had licensing budgets that they had to go through, but that said, I think especially given that, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right, have taken many iterations through the years of it being a big thing. I don't know, given the fact that they've been making movies for this, how expensive that's driven up licensing costs. I don't know, but I do think that this was a really iconic game. I also think that just based on genre representation alone, the side-scrolling beat-em-up was still a big genre back then. We played, we've talked about games like Magic Sword or Knights of the Round. There were many high-profile games that top developers were making at the time in this genre.
Final Fight.
I think that and this was a great example of it that, to me, it still holds up to the extent that anybody still has any interest in playing a side-scrolling beat-em-up game, which, again, we played Streets of Rage 2 on the podcast, we played this. I think that it's a great genre, and that if you're really going to capture the essence of what would a retro gamer who really loved the Super Nintendo era, what would they be looking for? I think that even if it wasn't this game, and I think this is probably the best game to choose, but I think this is a genre you would have wanted to see.
There are a lot of options,
and again, and I don't think Castlevania scratches that same itch. I don't think Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Super Ghosts and Goblins, I don't think it scratches the itch that both from a couch co-op standpoint and just kind of an ease of playability. They just sit down, you have a good time, and you just whack some dudes with Michelangelo, because that's my favorite turtle.
Exactly. So, Aaron, one of the things we talked about, we've already had a couple RPGs on the list, but I think we're missing at least one or two more. Aaron, what would you pick?
So the first one, for anybody who's listened to this show for any length of time knows, the one, I don't want to say glaring omission, because I'm sure this was one of the pricier games to potentially include.
Oh.
Well, if it was available, Chris, I'm sure that it would have made the list. But since it wasn't, since we don't have to go back in that alternate reality, Chrono Trigger, to me, it's the best game on the console, and I think that's the one I certainly would have liked to see. Now, again, Final Fantasy III, Secret of Mana, those are no games to sneeze at. No question. It's not like they didn't get some quality Square games on the list, but I think much in the way that when you looked at the Genesis collection that was released for PS2 when that first came out, right, they gave you all of the Phantasy Star games. They gave you all of the Shining Force games. Those are games that really defined that era and said, okay, Genesis, that it can hang with the big boys and it can produce top quality RPGs, and they gave you all of them. And I can't help but feel that, okay, if we're going to put that on the table as the precedent, then let's, especially if we're clearing out space for some bad games like Star Fox 2, why don't we bring the heat and just put all the great RPGs on there? So I think Chrono Trigger would definitely be the top of my list to include.
It has to be something with licensing. I just don't know what else it could be. That game is just such a glaring omission, especially since you've got other Squaresoft games that were just amazing. But you're right, Aaron. I wanna introduce another game that most definitely should have been on that list. And many of you, when you think amazing platformers, you probably don't think of Accolade, but maybe you should. Aaron, maybe you should. This game got a remake that unfortunately is not so good.
The plebes just didn't understand.
They didn't understand
Let's be honest.
And the game that really should be on their top 20, top one, best game ever, ladies and gentlemen, is Bubsy.
Yeah,
no,
Samus.
You're right.
Link?
Bubsy's better than Samus.
Who are these characters?
Actually, no, I'm lying.
Who are these mascot characters to tell Bubsy that he can't have a spot on the SNES Classic, Chris.
Bubsy needs to die in a fire. Okay,
I want to pause here. I am impressed, Chris, that we were able to produce a physical copy that is not coming from, you didn't have to go dumpster diving.
No,
I didn't. You didn't have to go to like the desert where the ET games are buried to find this
I just pulled it off my shelf.
You pulled it off your shelf?
I'm
pristine
ashamed.
Quality? This is
unplayed.
Rightly so. Yeah. Sorry, Bubsy. You don't make the list. We've got a lot of mascots, but Bubsy's not making the cut.
But I do have another Konami game. I swear I'm not a shill for Konami. And another couch co-op game that I think is really fun. We've done this on YouTube as a BC Plays episode. Zombies Ate My Neighbors.
Yeah.
This game was... It's funny because not many people really played this game. It is, for some reason, it didn't sell incredibly well. If you haven't seen it, please do your favor. Go to the YouTube page, search for Business Casual Gamers, and pull up this game, RBC Plays in this game. It is such a fun game to play co-op. I wouldn't say it's a great single-player game.
I agree.
But as a couch co-op kind of game, 2-player, it is so much fun, and it's also really fun to see your friends get mowed down by the chainsaw-wielding maniac. So.
Yeah, I think that Contra 3, if you only had to pick one, I'm glad that got the nod.
Yeah, I agree.
But I do think that, in part, I think that's a better single-player experience. But I do agree. I mean, Zombies Ate My Neighbors was an iconic game. I really think it's a lot of fun. I think it's still... That's one where you don't have to just be purely nostalgic to appreciate it. I think it's still fun today.
Mm-hmm. Now, Aaron, this is funny. We didn't intend for this to happen when we put all these things together as far as games that we should recommend or on here. All the remainder of the games we have left on the table are all RPGs.
Yeah, but we've got... I think that, Chris, for you and I and so many other gamers and so many listeners of this show, I mean, the RPG was the genre that this was the generation that really solidified the genre in most fans' minds. Now, the games might be different that they choose, but I think most people can agree if you were playing games at that time and you had any love for RPGs whatsoever, the Super Nintendo was the console that kind of scratched the itch. Now, we already talked about Final Fantasy III that did make the cut. You can't help but say, all right, where's the love for Final Fantasy II? Now, we can debate all day. If you had to pick one, which would you pick? I think that they probably picked the one that makes the most sense. But I will say that, Final Fantasy II it probably would have been other than Chrono Trigger, the next one that I would have put on the list. And you think of that. If they just sold you a console with Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III on it, you'd be willing to pay some money right there. To me, that it's not like I think they're having any problem selling this console or this product whatsoever, but there is a lot of people that if you just put those two games, Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy III together, they would need nothing else to be on the console and would just say, yeah, I know these games. I keep hearing about these games. If I miss them, I just want to play these games. And I think that definitely should have been on the list. I think once you get down ballot, if you will, and say, okay, those are like the best of the best. Those are the ones that everybody talks about. There are still some gems that are out there that if you were playing the console at the time, you'd probably know about these. But if maybe, let's say you weren't big into RPGs or you weren't playing, you probably like us, you didn't have enough money to be able to buy every game at the time. So you had to miss a couple. And one of those that I think that is worth going back to play is Lufia and the Fortress of Doom. This is the first one. There's also Rise of the Sinistrals, the sequel. But this was a really memorable game. I think it's not perfect. It's certainly not Final Fantasy quality in my mind.
It's a really good game,
but it is a solid RPG. If you want and enjoyed 16-bit era RPGs, this checked a lot of boxes and was a lot of fun. So I would definitely say I understand why this didn't make the cut when you look at the heavyweights that did. But I do think that if you were to say, okay, let's expand it a couple of games, let's shuffle some things around, I definitely think this is one that would be kind of knocking on the door to break the list. If you say, okay, well, maybe we could fit 5 more games in, I would put this one in the mix.
You're right. And, I think to round out the list here, I would put forth 2 other games that are a similar kind of quality to Lufia. One of those is Breath of Fire by Squaresoft. I think that one's a really interesting game. Breath of Fire is one that it was, again, not many people played, but it's a very good, very good iteration on a really good formula with kind of 3/4, like top-down battle system that's really fun. The other one I would probably mention as well is Illusion of Gaia. Now, this is a game that is just really fun. A lot of people didn't play this game, honestly. It has a little bit of an odd story, but again, a really, really good game. Of all these, Aaron, I think you're right. I think Final Fantasy II and Chrono Trigger are the two that probably need to be swapped out. You swap out something like Zombies Ate My Neighbors or Turtles in Time for one of the other games, and really you've got yourself a really strong 20.
Yeah, I think another one that we touched on or thought about was it's kind of in the same series or family. You've got ActRaiser, you've got Soul Blazer, Terranigma never came out in the U.S., but that was another really strong series of games that I think a lot of people associate with the console. Soul Blazer, I think some of those, ActRaiser is probably the most played of all of those. But I think Soul Blazer is my favorite of those three on the list. I loved that game growing up. And I think there's a lot of that kind of, I'll call it the B tier, not to talk down on the games, but games that you'd say they're not as iconic as a Mario or a Link to the Past. They're not as well known, but just high quality games that really anchored the console generation and made it into what we consider the greatest console. I think there are lots of those that if you wanted to keep going, you could very easily get to a top 40 list and say, like, wow, this is a really amazing console. Now, again, I think I'm very happy with the product they put out. I think they did a great job. But the fact that we can still kind of keep going and ticking off a ton of great games and saying, yep, that's available, that's available. This was just a really impressive console generation. And I'm glad that even though I think Nintendo has always been a company that's somewhat true to their roots, I'm really glad to see them finally trying to cater to that nostalgia and being a little bit more creative in how they package that and sell it to the public.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think that, this system is clearly it's not perfect. I really wish they had the opportunity to sell us, like you said, Aaron, an extra pack of 20 games you can plug in at the end or something that gives them the opportunity to tweak out the emulator to work for those 20 games, expand on those amazing things, and then give us some recurring revenue by asking us to buy these upgrade packs over time. I certainly would buy them. And it also allows us to get, the top tier games. Some of the games, kind of like an Earthbound, for example, are so expensive to buy physically, and kind of reduces the opportunity in my mind, for piracy, because some people go out and pirate Earthbound because they just cannot get access to the game other than that. And that's a big shame in my mind. There are a handful of Super Nintendo games that are just so incredibly hard to get that you have no other alternative. And so I think between that and and that extension we talked about, and the nostalgia we're also talking about, I think all that together is really going to put together a really compelling package. It'll be very interesting to see what happens moving forward, if they're gonna go for an N64 Mini, or if they're going to have some sort of extra iteration on the hardware we're already seeing to help continue that nostalgia train. But Aaron, I think this is a really, really good conversation we had. I hope that we have given you, the listener, a good idea of what to expect when you're looking to get one of these systems, what we think is great, what we think is not so great. I mean, in the end, I don't think you can go wrong. If you can find one of these for the market price, which I think is $80, you should definitely take the opportunity to pick that up. Show Nintendo that there's a big market for this, and we really want these kinds of things. Hopefully, I know it's hard to understand, but hopefully they'll actually listen to us. So before we wrap up the show, I want to remind you to please check us out on businesscasualgamers.com. There you find everything about the show, all of the links. Check us out on Twitter at BISCasualGamers, as well on YouTube. Just search for Business Casual Gamers. You'll find us there and all of our videos. Please also take the time and the opportunity to rate us in your favorite podcasting outlets, iTunes, Google Play, you name it. We really do appreciate those. Anything you can do to help us there. And again, thank you for listening. We will see you next time.
See you soon.